welcome. I was afraid with the weather and with all the worldly things going on, we might not have anyone here today, but thank goodness we do. This property has been purchased by the city, and first thing we found was a crepe myrtle that was overgrown. And if you've looked anywhere around our city, you see a lot of them that have been pruned. What I consider most horticulture agents and most ISA certified arborists say are incorrect ways of pruning when you head them back. We'll talk a little about that and the reasons why we don't do that, and some of the problems that incorrect pruning causes with our crepe myrtles, causes disease and insect problems also, and try to correctly prune this one so that we can see what one, if you correctly prune a crepe myrtle, a large crepe myrtle will have a season-round aesthetics. You have the bark in the wintertime that looks, if you've seen any of ours in the city, up in front of the Arlington, we have some huge crepe myrtles there that are very beautiful. Their bark is exfoliated off and exposed, and it looks really good in the winter versus the cutting off, the heading back. Then in the summer, obviously, we have a plant that blooms 2 to 3 months, and you have blooms throughout the summer. And then in the fall, a lot of the crepe myrtles will have the colorful leaves in the fall. And so you have a season-round plant, but by correctly or incorrectly topping that tree off at 5 feet, you do lots of things to the tree. Number one, there are 3 diseases or 3 pests of the crepe myrtle that we have here. And we didn't have one of them until about 2014, which is the crepe myrtle bark scale. If you've seen any crepe myrtles in our city or around your home that's turning black, when they turn black, that's from the excretions from the scale insects that are feeding on it. This tree has a few. If you look real close, you can see a few white specks here that is the early state or some of the early black crepe myrtle bark scale. They're an insect that attaches themselves to the tree, sucks the juices out of the tree, and can get very, very prolific, and you'll see them continually over the whole tree, and it'll turn black. The black is the sooty mold that is from the excretions from the insect that ferments and usually covers everything below that tree and on the tree. So that can be promoted by the cutting off or heading back. Anytime you do that, you're stressing the tree. This tree, the root system of a tree, if we have unless it's very, very cold, the root system of that tree continues to grow through the winter and produces the nourishment and the energy for that tree once it comes out of dormancy. When you cut the tree off about 5 feet, then all of that energy is released at green up. Where does it go? It has no place to go. And so all of those buds that have been released by cutting off, there is what we call a terminal bud at the end of each of your limbs at the very top. That terminal bud regulates the growth of that tree. When you cut it off, you've cut off the terminal bud. Now you've released all what we call epicormic buds, all those buds around under the trunk of under the bark of the tree. So how many of y'all have seen trees that have been cut off, and then when they do grow, instead of one trunk coming up or one main leader or a leader from that root system, you have 10 or 15 all of a sudden. And so you've released all those buds under there to grow. The neat thing about crepe myrtle is it blooms off of current year's growth. So you've released a lot of growth, you may get more blooms. That's up in the air whether you do or not. You may get more blooms, but you get weak growth that causes that tree to bend over with those heavy blooms, especially in rainy seasons, and it's not very appealing. And so cutting that tree off, you stress it. It makes it, if you look real close, the more common crepe myrtle bark scale cases are on trees that have been cut headed back because you've stressed that tree. What do insects do? They're opportunists. Just like disease, it's opportunists. When you do stress a tree, then the insects, the diseases are going to be more prominent. The other 2 things, it's on your handout, but the other 2 things are 2 fungal diseases. One is called powdery mildew. The other is called cercospora leaf spot, or just leaf spot is what most people call it. Have you ever had your crepe myrtle in the fall, late summer, prematurely turn red and then brown, and the leaves die off early and fall early. Well, that's from that leaf disease that is caused from lack of airflow through the tree. So what do we say already? When you cut that tree off, all that regrowth comes very thick, and so now there's no air movement in that tree. So then you promote those two fungal diseases, the powdery mildew, which turns the leaves white, and then the other is this leaf spot that causes it to fall off early. If you do have that problem, the main control, we try to use sprays as a last resort. You can spray with a fungal control. Probably chlorothalonil is the easiest one to come up with. Daconil, anybody ever use Daconil? That's real popular. That may be one you could use, but the main control is leaf sanitation. When those leaves fall off, you rake them up, remove them out of that area because that harbors the disease and overwinters. So those three things are promoted by the heading back, or the Crape, I'll go ahead and say it, Crape murder. That's what we call it. And so this is what promotes a lot of things. It promotes disease and insects, plus the aesthetics of it. I mean, we've all seen it. A lot of people do it in the winter, and then you have to look at those stubs all winter long. The big question I get a lot, and I don't know how much time to spend on that before we get started, but is now I have done that, or it has been done in the past to my crepe myrtle, how do I recover from, how do I get my tree back to what it should be? Anybody have that problem? I think someone already asked me that. And so there's a couple of options, maybe three. One is, you know, they always have those knots where you cut them off every year. That's where all that tries to grow out that has been kept all winter long, and it just grows those big knots. Number one, you can cut them off right below that knot. I never understood why people keep cutting them off above. You're going to get the knots even worse. You can cut it off right below that knot. Then what's going to happen? The same thing. You're going to get several sprouts that come back. Pick you 2 or 3 of those. It's going to take a little more work, but pick you 2 or 3 of those that grow in the direction you want them to grow. Cut the rest of them off. After they get a foot or 2 long, cut the rest of them off. Keep 2 or 3 for each one that you have there. After time, and it's not going to be a quick fix, but after time, those will fill back in and your tree will look normal again. The second option that most people gasp at when I say is to cut them off at ground level. You can cut the crepe myrtle off at ground level, take that same procedure, pick you 2 or 3 to 5 stems is usually common on a crepe myrtle. Pick you 3 to 5 stems you want to promote, cut the rest of them back and keep them cut back. Then over time it'll grow back. The other we did at, if you go to the district court up here, master gardeners, I see some master gardeners here, okay? And so they took this on. James was a part of that project. They cut through the middle of the knots and try to clean them up and and again pick 2 or 3 of those main stems that grow back. So that's kind of in a nutshell how you can recover from it. Obviously we'd rather not do that, but it happens, and so if you want to try to correct them back, the hardest part is trying to convince other people. I've already heard from some POAs and things. It is very quick. That's why I'll see a lot of our landscape people do it. It's very quick. You know, you can cut them off. Crepe myrtle is one that does flower off a current year growth, and so you will still have flowers. It will grow back. Look, but the aesthetics of it and the hard it is on the tree as far as trying to grow properly. It just stresses the tree where it does become susceptible to disease and insects. So that's the biggest issue right there, along with the aesthetics of it. Some really prime, good examples I mentioned earlier. If you go up by the Arlington, city owns some big crepe myrtles there in the medians that are just gorgeous. You know, their bark is exfoliated. Haven't been pruned. I talked to the Parks Department back when I did a video on that. If you haven't seen it, if you go to our website, I believe it's on YouTube. It's on there, and I went through some things. I talked about the bark scale and how to control it. I should throw that out there too. I will at the end about how to control bark scale if you have it. All right, so anytime we prune, any questions before we start pruning about what we kind of covered? First thing you want to do,
Sterilize your cutting tools so you don't spread bark scale.
that's a good prop. Anytime you move from tree to tree especially, or if you remove some tree limbs that have the bark scale, sanitizing your pruners before you go to the next tree especially, 70% alcohol or either 1 part bleach to 9 parts water. That'll sanitize your pruners before you move on to another tree. Good point. Anytime you prune anything, whether it's fruit trees, ornamental trees, you need to have a plan. You need to answer 3 questions. Why am I pruning the tree? When do I prune this tree? And obviously the one we're here today to is how do I prune this tree? The why we prune the tree I've kind of covered, to help keep the tree healthy so it can combat disease and insects. Sometimes we have an issue with where it's at in the setting, and we want to try to maybe make it smaller to fit that setting. That's when selection comes in so important in the beginning. Crepe myrtle has 8 different sizes that you can select from. Everything from a shrub all the way up to a 25-footer. And those are all listed at the UAEX website. Alex, let me introduce Alex. Alex is a county agent for Garland County. He will help you with your home landscapes, and they have all kinds of free services up there that you can take advantage of as far as tree diseases, how to grow trees, and they have a lot of great fact sheets at the University of Arkansas. Alex would be glad to help you with that, but you can go on their line and they have a database that has all the crepe myrtle sizes, their colors of their foliage or the color of their blooms, everything about them. So primarily, if you put the right plant in the right place, you don't have a lot of pruning with crepe myrtle. But there always comes that issue where they're not in the right spot, maybe they're overgrown. So the first question you ask is, why am I pruning it? One is for the aesthetics, one is for the airflow in the middle. We always want airflow through because of the 2 fungal diseases that we talked about. And then always want to make sure that we don't have limbs that, once we get to that point, we're going to have limbs that cross over and rub, limbs that are broken or diseased, those will all come out. And once you do that, you never want to take away more than about 25, depending on the size of the tree, 25% to 30% of the tree, or at least a quarter to a third at the most, at any one time. This tree is a little unique in that it's been neglected, but this city just bought this building, and so they put a water line in right here and severed part of the root system on it. Old school ideas, Freddy and I, let me introduce Freddy. Freddy's an arborist also for the city of Hot Springs, oversees the forestry crew. Freddy and I were talking earlier, old school was, if you remove roots, you remove about the same amount of crown. That's old school. We really think, that was, you wouldn't have as much to do, but now we've kind of rethought that. And when we think about root removal, we want to leave more crown to kind of help that tree recover and develop more roots. So if you take away a lot of the nourishment facility of that tree, well, then you're actually defeating your purpose as far as getting your roots to grow back. When they asked me to come look at this tree back before they started digging, I said, well, it's a crepe myrtle. You can't hardly kill a crepe myrtle. So we went ahead and dug this down through here, and we're going to see how it turns out. But they're tough trees. We've all seen that when they've been cut back. So why do we prune? We've got a reason why. When to prune, that's always important with ornamentals. The rule of thumb is if they flower early in the season, like your forsythia, quince, things like that, you wait till after they bloom to prune. If they bloom in the summertime, which basically means they bloom off of current year growth, the ones that bloom now are blooming off of last year's growth. The ones I mentioned, forsythia, quince, things like that that are blooming now, they're bloomed off of last year's growth. So if you pruned them before they came out of dormancy, you cutting off all the blooms. But on a tree like the crepe myrtle that blooms during the summer, we can prune it back before the growing season, and then it will still produce the blooms we want it to produce. So know when to prune, why to prune, Now let's talk about how to prune. Anytime you start with a tree, if you look at this tree, what sticks out is all the regrowth at the base of it, all the what we call water sprouts. Those that are going to, and some crepe myrtles are more prone to that than others. And they always, when I was at Extension and Alex's position, I got lots of questions. How can I just spray them? Why can't I just spray those and get rid of them? Well, they're connected to the mother tree. You spray them with a systemic herbicide of some type, well then you're going to damage the main tree. So really the only recourse you have is to prune those out. And so pruning them out is the thing to do. Remove them, and they may come back during the summer and you'll just have to redo that. Some of the crepe myrtles are a little less prone to that, some are more prone. So I don't have a schedule on which is which, but if you will, just prune those out. And that's going to take your cuts. We have some, yeah, go ahead. You go ahead. I'll talk about the cuts while you're doing that.
Okay.
Having the right tools, little hand pruners, a pair of loppers, a little saw. Those saws are real handy down low, especially with the water spout, because you can't really get a bow saw in there or something. You might get a pruner in there, but the little hand saw works really good. While he's doing that, we'll try to kill two birds with one stone. I'm going to show you correctly where to make your cuts. Here's a real good example of one that was made wrong. So anytime you make a cut on a limb, you want to cut it back at a growing point. And the reason you do that is because what we call, maybe you can all see here. Each of these points is a growing point. If you cut below a growing point, that internode area between the two growing points will not callus back and heal. That's a good example right there. Someone cut that off instead of cutting it off at the collar here. They cut it off out here. Probably someone that was growing in there over the cars or something, and they cut it off. So now what is that? That's a great spot for disease to get into that tree because it won't heal over. It's a great spot for insects to get into that tree. So that's why we cut them at a growing point. So, or you can come back to what we call the collar of the tree. If you cut on the limb, you should cut back at a growing point, right above it. A lot of times you can cause that tree to grow the direction you want it to grow just by cutting off at a point that's growing the way you want it to grow. So keep that in mind. We do that with roses a lot. If you've ever pruned roses, you go to a bud that's growing out just to keep it from growing in. Anytime you let stuff grow inside of the tree or plant, you're doing two things. You're doing two things. One, you're cutting off the airflow, and two, most of our ornamentals, especially fruit trees, I don't know if anybody grows fruit trees, but sunlight's the most important thing to make your fruit grow. So if you're leaving the middle, the only place you're going to have fruit is growing around the perimeter of that tree because you don't have sunlight getting into the middle. So opening the tree up in the middle, removing all of that is really important, not only in ornamentals, but in fruit and other things. So always make your cuts just above a growing point or at the collar. Anybody want to understand on this side, for example, if we're going to, and we probably will correct this, that would be cut at the collar. It's real obvious here where the collar is, where this is grown out and swelled, that's the edge of the collar. We don't want to cut back into the vein behind the collar, or you severely expose more of the tree than needs having. It won't callus. Trees they don't really heal. It's called callusing over. They will grow. We've all seen a spot. I don't know if we can find one that's been correctly pruned, but over time it will fill in. And the trees have all the things that they need just in that area there already to make that happen. Next question I usually get is, what about pruning paints? We don't recommend those anymore. Used to have pruning paints everybody used. Thought it would make it heal better. We found that those pruning paints actually hold moisture in there, can cause more disease problems. So you might use it in some cases. I've seen where it does work. If you're cutting mistletoe off your tree, maybe use it and it helps keep it from growing back. But on a normal tree situation, we really don't use any type sprays or things like that to cover wound dressings, we call it. We have a lot of trees in our city that get hit by cars, especially those in the medians out here on Grand Avenue. And so basically on a wound, what you do, if you cut it at the collar, there's nothing else to do. But if you do have a wound, maybe on this mechanical, someone backed into your tree or whatever happened, the best advice I can give you is treat that wound just like you would if you had a wound on your arm. Clean it up around the perimeter. It'll callus. You've all probably seen where they callus over. That won't fill back in. It'll always be a spot where insects and disease can get into it. But it will callus around the edges and kind of sear over and help what we call compartmentalize that tree area. So basically that's what we try to look at, is try to get all the main, pretty good undertaking. Freddy might want me to help him a little bit. But try to take that. This tree has been neglected so long. Look up here. One of the limbs has actually grown back into the other limb. And so anytime we're going through the tree, once we get these water sprouts out, that's what we're going to look at. Do we have any limbs that grow back to the center of the tree? Do we have any that are crossing over and rubbing? Do we have any that are dead or potentially they're dying? Then those would be candidates to take out. You do all that first before you start trying to remove any of the other excess. Now, question was already asked this morning. I wanted to lower my tree. How do I lower my tree? Instead of just discriminately going through and cutting the tree, what do you know? I've already told you, you go to a point. If you wanted to lower this tree, if it was too tall, what we recommend is coming down the tree to a lateral limb, one that's growing lateral, that it's at least 1/3 the size of the one you want to cut off. Then cut it at right above that growing point, just like you would as I showed you here. For example, if this was the top of the tree, I would come down and here's a lateral, we're going to call this lateral. Here's a lateral limb that is at least 1/3 of this size, then I would prune it right above that joint. And then that will take over. You don't release, you remember I talked about the epicormic buds, or the buds that once you take that dominant bud off the top of the tree, once you take that off, then you release all the other buds that are just going to grow discriminately. If you cut at a growing point, that makes this one now the apical bud. And so that would keep that from happening. If you just go up and talk, how many have seen, we've all seen, trees on a power line that has been just cut back. So what does it happen? You know, Arkansas always say it's growing hair like on a dog's back. It's just growing up. It's so thick. It just, after a while, it gets so thick it just starts drooping. It dies. It's weak. It eventually will kill the tree over time. Not in the next few years, but over time, it will be the demise of that tree. So that was what would happen if you came through and just cut it out. Same principle. You want to come down the tree, and that's kind of a last resort. We really don't recommend topping back a tree at all. But if you do have to lower that crown, you can come down the main limbs to a vertical, one that's growing vertical, that's at least 1/3 the size of the one you want cut off. Cut it off right above that joint. Remember, don't leave a stub, and don't cut back into the tree. Cut at the collar of that tree.
Alan, what would you say was the age of that tree?
Oh, wow. I don't know. Probably when they built, I don't know, it's probably since the building. It's probably 20, 30 years old, I would say. Yep. Just guessing.
When you say cut off vertical limb,
Horizontal, you're correct. Horizontal. Yes. Yeah, horizontal, not vertical.
If you were cutting back stuff like he's doing, would you cut it closer to the ground?
He's going to, yes.
Is there a typical growth size on all crepe myrtles every year? In other words, if I cut a crepe myrtle off at such and such point, it would probably, a typical growth size would be what?
2 to 3, 4 feet. Yeah, 3 or 4 feet. Usually it depends on the tree and size of the tree.
Yeah.
But yeah, it has a lot of growth because it does flower off of that growth. And so they can grow. You know, if you were trying to recover from the crepe murder and you cut it off at the ground level, I would expect that thing to be 4, 5, 6 feet tall by the end of the season. And you can select those what you want to keep and let it, you'd start a whole new tree over. But yes, he's just cutting those off. We'll come back, cut those off at the ground level. The closer you can cut them off to the ground level, the better. You can already see it's opening up the tree tremendously. It's exposing that beautiful bark, and it's getting that airflow. Remember what we said about the airflow, that controls 2 of your fungal problems. If you've ever had powdery mildew, your leaves turn brown or white, or if you've had the circuit spore, the leaf spot, then they're going to turn reddish, real reddish color, and then eventually black, and they're going to fall off.
Now,
And so,
what I've noticed on sometimes our crepe myrtles is on the main trunk there, from the ground up to the first limb, they'll have little sprouts coming out. I don't know what you call those, but
Yep.
is it good to trim those back?
absolutely, good point. The question was sprouting below where you want the tree to have limbs, and those we call them water sprouts, or and you can cut those back any time of the year. Doesn't matter. As the year goes along, you can prune a tree any time of the year, a certain amount. I mean, if you've got a limb hanging down on your car, or visibility problem, we do that in the city all year long. We get lots of calls about stop signs that are limbs growing down and keeping you from seeing a stop sign. So you can prune them. Just remember the main cuts, where you make your cuts is so important. Above a growing point or at the actual collar of the tree. Here's a good, he's going to cut this one at the collar.
Where's the collar of the long one?
What do you mean? Like this?
Yeah, one that hasn't been cut before. Is the collar just a little bit away from the trunk, or
Right there.
maybe where?
He's going to take that one. He'll show you. You're going to take that one off. Yes, you don't want to.
Well, that's kind of long, isn't it?
Well, he's just getting the first cut. Now that's a good point. He's making that first cut so that if he were to cut out here, if he had just made it from the top with the weight on it, it could have ripped it. And so you'll make your undercut and then take that. Now he'll come back and cut that stub off. So it's a 3-way cut. And that's to protect the tree, especially if you have a heavy limb and you just start cutting at the collar from the top. Once all that weight hits that cut, it'll rip down the side of the tree and rip it. So you do a 3-way cut. He undercut it, then he cut from the top, and now he's going to cut back where you actually want to cut. That way you don't rip the tree at the bark. Does that make sense? So that's really a good, these will callus over. Remember I said they won't heal over. They won't, it's not called healing. It calluses from the outside and grows in. And that's natural on the tree. It'll take care of.
So the collar is where it's kind of wider by the trunk, and as it gets thinner, then that's where you cut it off.
That's right. That's right. And slabbing it off, what's my term here? I've forgotten. Where we slab them off.
Flush cut.
Flush cut. If we flush cut it, we cut behind the collar, and you take off so much of it. All of your components are inside of the collar that helps heal it. Compartmental. If you cut behind that collar and you flush cut it and you take off a long, it never heals up and it's always exposed. So it's real important. You don't want to cut back so far that you take off part of the bark and you remove the collar.
Yeah.
What do you think about these big ones? All right, I just asked him about that big limb that's going into the middle. You all see this here?
Yeah.
See how it would open it up. But we have to think a minute. This tree's been neglected for a long time.
It's cracked too on the side.
We may or may not take that out simply because we want to try. Don't want to take more than about 1/3 of the tree at one time. It might be something next year we want to take out. Don't overdo it. Always, and to be honest with you, you could have 5 arborists here pruning this tree, and it would be pruned 5 different ways. It could be pruned 5 different ways. The basic principles you need to take care of. Yes, sir.
The horizontal limb is cracked. Like that opened up to the seeds over here. It's ready to bust off.
Oh yeah, I see it there. Yeah,
So
we're going to end up taking it out.
Just gonna have to take that off.
Yeah.
Like this one up here
Yep.
where it's black. The first
Is that disease there where the black spots are on those limbs?
more or less.
Big
It's
limb on
just
there.
rotting. It's rotting.
Right.
Yep, it's rotting, and it will be a prime place for the disease to get into it. But obviously, we can already see how much we've opened this tree up. We're trying to keep it where airflow can get through it, keep it where, for lots of purposes, more flowers, get more sunlight into the plant. I'm going to do one on fruit tree pruning here in a few weeks. We're getting pretty close. I got to do it. We put a bunch of fruit trees in out at the family park. We had to take trees down because of the airport. They had grown up so high they were in the runway and across the road, so we had to take those down. FAA made us. And so I planted back a lot of low-growing fruit trees in that same area that won't get over 15 feet tall. And so when you plant a young tree, even an ornamental, you can come back and what we call it's a little different process, but it's basically you're pruning it, but you're training. That's another word we want to use. We're training that tree. We take out any codominants when we have two stems that are identical. Take one of them out now. Then when the tree gets old, you don't have the weight of that tree being split out. You want to take limbs off that are crossing. You want to train fruit trees, a little different than ornamentals, but you want to basically, you're looking for more airflow and sunlight because sunlight produces fruit, and that's what we want. So if anybody's interested in fruit trees, we're going to do one in a couple of weeks out at the family park out there. I'll get word to Alex too, and he can get a master gardener. But we're going to do a fruit tree pruning. And then I need to do a little pruning on some, if you've been by the airport, last year they redone the entrance to the airport, and we put in 13, I believe, Chinese pistache. Chinese pistache are a real beautiful tree in the fall. One of the first things that turns bright red. And they need just a little pruning to kind of train them a little bit. So any type of young tree you want to try to do as much as you can early, not too much, but just enough to get it growing the way you want it to grow.
Is that stuff that falls off the Cape Myrtle every year, is that actually the bark?
Yes, the bark,
It sheds the bark every year?
not every year.
Oh,
As a tree matures, your early stages of your crepe myrtle, once they get to a mature, they will do what's called exfoliating bark. The bark will come off and expose this. That's why we like to look at them during the winter, so we don't cut them off. It's because once they get mature, the bark does come off of them. Some up there, it's called exfoliating bark. If you've seen our elm trees up on Bathhouse Row or Central Avenue, the city has in those little squares in the ground. They're called Chinese elm, lace bark elm. They're designed to fit those areas and grow in the city into the very difficult areas. They have exfoliating bark. The bark on them is coming off too to expose that real pretty aesthetics. Sir. Lace bark elms. Yeah. Chinese elm, I think, is also called. We've got several of them around the city.
I have a pretty young crepe myrtle, maybe since that fall, but it's close to the house.
Uh-huh.
So we can't just do it. I have a break up a big wall.
Uh-huh.
So as I go through, do I want to just follow the 25-30% rule on keeping it away from the house?
You can, yes,
And
yes.
I just follow the other rules on
Usually
take a vote of powder on it.
25 to 30%, and that applies, the older the tree, the more you need to adhere to that. A younger tree, you might take a little more off if needed. But an older tree, they don't recover as quick, kind of like I'm finding out in my own life. They don't recover as quick as they get old. And so the same principle applies there, but yes, you can, some will say 25, some will say 30%, but the smaller trees, you can get a little more off if you need to. You're not going to kill your tree. And again, let me say, if you need to prune that tree during the summer, if there's something that it's blocking the view or it's getting in the sidewalk or whatever it may be, it's fine to prune any time of year. Just keep in mind, heavy pruning we usually do this time of year. It depends on the plant. I'm going to look like I did something whether I did it or not.
kill that bug that eats a crepe.
Okay, that's a good question. I would said I'd mention that toward the end. you have to keep in mind anytime we deal with insects, we want to know the first thing that anybody asks you, entomologist, horticulture agent, what you have to realize what kind of mouth parts does it have. Is it chewing the leaves off of it, or is it sucking the juices out of it? Scale, or they have sucking mouth parts, so they're sucking the juices out of it. And these are not armored. There are some that are armored. In other words, they attach themselves. These do. They attach themselves only a short period of the year. They're in the crawler stage where they're hatching out and moving across the tree. The rest of the time they're attached to that one spot and don't move. So just over the top conventional sprayers or contact sprays, unless you catch them in the crawler stage, doesn't really work very well at all. And so the easiest way is a systemic. And the systemic gets into the system of the tree, and you mix it together, and I'll follow instructions. Imidacloprid is the one most popular, and bare tree and shrub. If you ever use a little blue bottle, Walmart handles it, and it'll tell you on the label how to mix and pour it around the base of the tree, and the timing of that's really important. We're about to get there. April time frame for here. We're about in the middle of April or 1st of April. Buy that systemic, mix it according to the label, depending on the size of the diameter of your tree. Pour it around the base of the tree, and it systemics up into that tree, and as the insect feeds on those juices, it kills the insect. Works really well. It'll last a full year. You won't have to do it again, and in some cases it's lasted up to 2 years. I would recommend using it. Then I wouldn't recommend using it again until you start seeing the symptoms again. No need in using that. It's fairly expensive, but it works really good. You can spray for the tree. There's a fact sheet at the U of A, UAX. Alex can tell you about that. There's a fact sheet that talks all about it. There are some other things you can use, what we call a dormant oil. Is that familiar with anybody? You mix it in the winter, as the name implies, during dormant time, and spray the tree. Could be pretty challenging to get up in a large tree, but if you get that in there, those insects overwinter in the crevices and the cracks, and so once you get that in there, it does kind of like insecticidal soaps. It covers the body of the insect and it smothers it. Those work a little more challenging to put out. The easiest way is to pour the systemic. Those work also. Fair.
Well, I thought the bugs that I was seeing on some of our crepe myrtles were aphids.
There are some
I thought
aphids.
maybe it wasn't. I didn't
There
know.
are some aphids that do get on crepe myrtle, but aphids are more. I'll give you a good example. Anybody got a hackberry around their house? There's an aphid that gets on. Have you ever had black stuff or sticky stuff get on your car under it? That's that honeydew. That's the same thing, but it's from an aphid. Anything has sucking mouth parts will have that honeydew under it. So when I was at Extension, I'd get calls in the fall. There's these little white floating things in the air. It looks like snowflakes. That's a hackberry woolly aphid. If we don't have a lot of rain in the late summer, they're asexual. They reproduce without mating. They just cover the whole tree. And so they suck those juices, everything under it will get sticky from that and turn black. The control for it's the same this time of year. So you get the calls, Alex, you'll get the calls in the fall. You want to know how to control it. Well, it's too late. You control it in the spring by putting that systemic around that tree and keeping those insects from ever getting in it. And so they're the same. Those are aphids. They're mobile. They're fairly mobile. The male is the only one mobile in the bark scale, and so the idea of how it gets spread is when we have the landscapers move from house to house to houses, and they don't sanitize their pruners, and they throw all this in the back of their truck, and they have it right there, and so they're able to just get on the tree. So they can't move very far. So the main way they're moved is in new plant material. Again, we didn't even have the bark scale in Arkansas until 2014. Now, when I was an agent at that time, we had the first cases I saw in Garland County were down on the lake south of town. Now it's all the way up through town and all the way into the village. It's in the village also. So it's spreading. Does the tree look better?
Yeah.
Again, we'll come back, just for time's sake, we'll come back and cut all this down at the bottom. He's just trying to get through and kind of give some good ideas. Yes, the closer to the ground, the better. Yep, these sprouts, the closer you get to the ground, the better. Some of them are coming off the trunk, some are on the ground. So just wherever you can get to them, get them out. And that's going to give you that, boy, it's going to open that pretty bark up. We'll be able to see it.
Oh, it looks like a big bush.
Yeah, if you look at the one down there, and I don't know what, maybe somebody pruned it in the past, but it doesn't look bad at all. So I guess the main takeaways I want you to get is always the correct pruning spots, where to cut that tree or to cut the limb. The second is know why you want to do it. Make sure you have a reason, not just because my neighbor's doing it. And that's the one I get the most. Well, that's the way I see my neighbors doing it. The biggest thing when I was at Extension Outlet was when Master Gardeners had a project, and part of that project was not taking care of the Crape Myrtles, and then the landowner or the actual city or county would come through, the county in that case, would come through and cut them off. And then people would say, well, the Master Gardeners are doing that, when they really weren't. And so,
guys are gone.
that one coming down?
Yeah, I didn't see it, but I heard talking about being busted.
Yeah.
Busted out.
Heads up.
Splitting
Yeah, he'll come back on that. I'm about to wear my pruners now. What? That's going to really open the middle up. And you can see there's some more that we'll probably quit before we get there this year. Next year we'd kind of clean it up a little bit because we're going to get it may be 30% of this tree at least.
So, this side of this one, split off during lace thing. I don't know if you can see it from where you
Which
are.
one are we talking about?
Here,
This one.
here.
Is it ever too late to come back and just kind of clean that up?
Great question. Is it ever too late to come back and prune those incorrect prunings out? No, it's not. It's not. You can prune that back.
Looks like you can't really get in.
Right. It'd be a little difficult to get that one.
Go ahead and square them off.
You can. Yep. Absolutely. Yep.
These big limbs will always get out, huh?
Yes. Yep. Any other questions?
Like a chainsaw to cut some
Can you use a chainsaw? Sure. You can use a chainsaw. It can be a little bit.
chain pruner things, a little electric guy.
Can. They're a little bit. They may be a little more harder on the tree in some cases, but be sure that I might ought to go over that 3-step method again. You remember us talking about that, where if you have, for example, if I was to remove this limb,
Okay, this branch here.
if for whatever reason, maybe it's damaged and broke. If I was to remove this limb with all that weight on it, if I just start cutting here at the collar, when I get right in here, what's going to happen? It's going to fall, and it's going to start ripping all the way down through here. So with this, remember, even with the chainsaw, you can do that. Undercut about 1/3. I usually come out past that undercut and go above and cut down. And then if it does rip, it'll stop at that first cut I made. And once it's off, then you would come back and cut this stub off. That just helps precautionary to keep from ripping the tree.
Well, I've heard in the past that the angle that you cut your limbs off, like a big limb like that, if you cut it straight off, it would hold the moisture in there. To cut it at a slant, is that
That can be. I mean, if it is, especially up high in the tree or somewhere that's flat, if you want to angle it a little bit. But again, you want it at that key point, whether it's above a node, a growing point, or at the collar. Most of the time, they're going to dictate to you how to cut them because of the way the collar is. And most of them are going to be at an angle anyway. So, but yeah, that could be fine.
Good job, Freddy. Well, I'm not done.
Well, I'm giving
Get
out.
You'll give out.
Yeah.
You'll cut all this out, won't you, all over the top?
I'm gonna thin it out, yes,
We'll
sir.
thin it a
All
little
those
bit.
water suckers up through here.
Yeah.
Not all
No.
of it. This right here is kind
That
of
whole
a bare
limb,
spot.
you might take that whole limb off.
But
right there.
these smaller branches like this, you'll leave some of this up here at the top.
Yes.
Oh yeah, yeah. He's pretty much
That's
through
where your
in the
new,
top.
that's where your blooms are going to be.
Yeah, they'll grow out. Now, I usually get the question, what about? A lot of them will retain their bud or their berries and things at the end of the limbs. Now, I usually get the question, should I remove them or not? Well, it's either way. It doesn't matter. A lot of people will just grab them, say if there were buds here, and do that, and they'll all come off. If you want them off and you're capable of reaching them, you know, a tree like this would be difficult to get up in the top. You can see some of them up in the top.
What's the idea of taking the buds off?
Some people just mainly, does that help the tree or not? No, either way, you can leave them or take them. Mainly the aesthetics of it, looking at them. At
You'll
your
get
own,
new growth on this.
yeah. Yeah, you'll get new growth on the ends, yeah. And that's where if you ever look at a crepe myrtle, that's where you'll get your flowers, at the
Yeah.
ends of the limbs, because that's the new growth. Now, I've been pushing another tree. And the only reason I have, crepe myrtles are tough, they're beautiful, they flowers 2 to 3 months out of the summer. But another tree that basically does the same thing and doesn't have any issues with bark scale, with disease, that maybe if you're in your landscape, if you want to plant something that may not have this potential care as far as insects and so forth, it's called a vitex. Vitex or chaste tree, C-H-A-S-T-E tree. Blooms off a new growth, only gets about 15 foot tall. There aren't those variety selections in it like the crepe myrtle. Had no insect or disease problems. Flowers off of the new growth, and it has blooms also, 2 to 3 months out of the summer, just like. We may plant some of those this year. It's called a vitex, V-I-T-E-X.
Where do you get them, I wonder?
At the nurseries. Nurseries have them. I've seen them at Walmart or
Oh, really?
at Lowe's and places like that will have them also. They're really popular in Texas. You see a lot of them in Texas. Another name for it is hemp tree. It has palmate leaves like a hemp plant, and they call it hemp plant. Vitex, chase tree, there's several names. But it is a real beautiful summer bloomer, just like the crepe myrtle, no disease or insect problems. So we may plant some of them. We're talking about planting some of them. If you've seen the renovations out at Family Park from the road, they're putting a log fence, kind of rail fence there. We're talking about maybe planting some of the vitex down through there. Like I said, they'll bloom off 2 or 3 months out of the summer. Really pretty trees. A lot of people call them butterfly tree. They look like, are you familiar with the Padilla butterfly bush? It has the long bottle-looking blooms on the end. That looks just like that nearly. Very, very attracted to the butterflies, the bees, and the hummingbirds. They love that tree. They really come to it. Vitex or chase tree.
Checks get about how tall?
About 15. About 15 feet. But then again, there's not the selections like we have with crepe myrtle. You can get off the side. But then again, if the tree is opened up and pruned properly, you don't really have as much disease or insects. If you look around the city, where I see most of the crepe myrtle bark scale, now not all of it, but most of it, is on the trees that have been headed back. And it stresses that tree. Insects are opportunists, so they're going to be, if they get started on it, they're really going to, we can all look up this tree and see things we'd like to change now, but remember our 1/3 rule. We don't want to take, this tree has grown over time. We can't do it all in its first year. And so basically, if you get these water sprouts, open it up, get the damage and the crossover limbs, it's about all you can do this time. And it still makes the tree very attractive once you get it finished.
Now, theoretically, as long as you keep the water spouts cut off, these big trunks will just always be like that and only be blooming outside edge of the limbs.
That's right. Yep. So once you get the tree, like I said, those trees up there in front of the Arlington, I talked to the Parks Department. They haven't pruned those in 4 or 5 years. They haven't even been pruned, but they were pruned correctly and allowed to grow where they had space to grow. And so there's really not that much maintenance to them.
Person, has anybody ever trimmed a crepe myrtle where you only had one trunk and made it like a tree?
Okay?
Is that possible?
The question was, can you prune it to one trunk? Yes, you can. Absolutely. You know, in landscaping or in horticulture, we do the odd numbers. So 1, 3, 5 trunks, ever what you want. You can prune it. You can go back to what I talked about a little earlier. You can train that tree from the beginning. Once you plant it that first year, start training it to be that way. You know, select 3 or 2 or 5 or 1 and let it grow that way. Sure, absolutely. Yep, you can grow it single trunk.
It'll be a whole new look, have just one trunk.
Yeah, I have some at home that way.
Really?
Yep, sure do.